Well, my name is Sterling McKusick. I was born in Holton, Wisconsin, which is right across the bridge from Stillwater, Minnesota. And in 1936, during the Depression, my family moved over to St. Paul, Minnesota, to the Lower East Side of St. Paul, and lived around in various places around the Lower East Side throughout going through my school years. Graduated from high school and at Harding High School on the east side of St. Paul in 1947. And all of the people from World War II, many of the servicemen were back, of course, and jobs were not plentiful, and my family did not have money to get me through college or whatever, and I didn't have any job that I could rely upon. So 6 months after graduating from high school, then I enlisted in the Marine Corps for 3 years.
And why did you decide the Marines?
Well, I had an uncle during World War II who was with the Marines with Carlson's Raiders, which was quite a well-known organization. And I don't know, I just was gravitated towards that branch of the service and decided that's what I wanted to do. So ended up enlisting for the 3 years, and then of course during the war, then we were held over for another year after that. And then after getting out of the regular Marine Corps, then some years later I went into the reserve and spent another 9 years in the reserve in Minneapolis there.
And when and where did you enlist?
Well, we started out, there was a recruiting station in St. Paul, but then to get sworn in, we had to go over to the federal building in Minneapolis, and was sworn in on January 28th of 1948, and along with, I think there were 5 of us, and one I knew, the other 3 I did not know, and they took us down to the train station, and we boarded a train and went to California to Camp Pendleton, to Marine Corps Recruit Depot at San Diego, for boot camp, and spent 3 months there in boot camp.
And can you tell me, what was boot camp like for the Marines?
Well, it was quite an experience, believe me. It was entirely different to life than I'd ever had before. And food was good, but the discipline was very high, and we were monitored pretty much 24 hours a day for those 3 months. Never left the base. You never left the barracks without permission, and we did what we were told, and fortunately most of us got through it. So,
what was the transition like?
From civilian life? Well, of course, my civilian life prior to that time was kind of at loose ends prior to enlisting. So I accepted the discipline very well. I enjoyed as much as you can. I enjoyed my time in the boot camp.
So, when did you go over to Korea? When and where did you land?
I went over there with the 1st Marine Division, and we landed in Incheon on September 15th of 1950. That was 3 months after the war had started. There started in June, and 1st Marine Division went over there in September and landed in Incheon. There was a contingent of Marines that went in August down on the brigade, but I wasn't part of that group.
And what was it like initially when you very first arrived?
Well, of course, that was a totally different experience, because for the first time you see people who are dead, and there was prior to going in there that morning, the Incheon harbor was filled with American warships and firing on Incheon, and it was just then continual. The whole night before that was just one round after another. We were our ship was not too far ahead of the battleship Missouri, who was putting some really big rounds into there. So it was a continual noise going on. There was no sleep the night before whatsoever. So then next day, then we had to get on the old rope ladders that everyone sees in the movies and go down and get in the little Higgins boats and head for shore. And it was when we went in, we were not opposed at that time, so we did not receive any fire going into shore. Got on shore and formed up again, and went off to our designated area to do our thing there for a while.
So how did it feel, that day and night before?
Oh, it was a tense time. You're concerned, and they kept us advised by a loudspeaker aboard ship as to how things were going, and we knew that they were going very well at that point, because there was a small island called Wamido was out in the Bay of Incheon there, and that was taken first, and then there was a causeway that went from that to the mainland, and that had to be all secured before any of the troops could go into Incheon City, and that they took the island very, very quickly. The First Marine, the Fifth Marine Regiment went in on that one, and took that, and so by the time that later in the day when our group went into it, we didn't encounter any resistance at that point.
So what were your initial duties?
Well, my duties were always the same. I was trained as a tank mechanic when I got out of boot camp. Went up to Camp Pendleton in California and was trained there, and spent 2.5 years at a little base just on the beach from Camp Pendleton called Camp Del Mar. That's where we trained for amphibious landings and then things. And my responsibility was to repair tracked vehicles, and that's what I did for the 2.5 years prior to, well, not quite that long, after get boot camp, and 2.5 years before the war broke out. And so we were doing the same thing once we got to Korea, but in a totally different structure, because we didn't have a base set up or things of that nature. What service we were able to do was done with service trucks and things of that nature. And we continually on the move, as quickly as you could, as quickly as the infantry up ahead was moving ahead, we had to move ahead to support them.
So can you tell me kind of your journey? You landed at Incheon, and then where did you go from there?
Well, we stayed in Incheon for, I'm not sure, perhaps a week. I think we were in Incheon about a week, and then we moved on up to Yeongdong-po, which was on the river, Han River, and then we went across there into the city of Seoul, and we stayed in Seoul, I suppose, 3 weeks, and then by that time the decision was made. Seoul was liberated, Seoul being the capital city, and it was decided that the 1st Marine Division was going to go back aboard ship and go all the way down around the bottom and come up on the east side and make an amphibious landing at Wonsan in North Korea. And so that was what happened to us at that point. We all went back aboard ship, went on the ships to travel around, and as we got up close to Wonsan, it was heavily mined, and so we spent about 10 days waiting for the minesweepers to clear the waters as much as they could. And so we would head north in the daytime, and we would head south at nighttime, and we just never got any further than that. And so by the time that we had gotten to Wonsan, I guess much to our chagrin or whatever, the city was already liberated, and in fact Bob Hope was giving a show on shore. And so we went into Wonsan completely unopposed. And from that point we moved north and on up to Hamhung, up further up in North Korea.
And can you tell me more about that?
Well, we stayed in Wonsan there for a period of time while they were regrouping everything, and so we eventually in our unit, our battalion moved on up on the coast further up. There was Hamhung and the other city that sounds so much the same. Anyway, we were up there for a period of perhaps 3-4 weeks, and then it was decided, MacArthur decided that he was going to send the 1st Marine Division further on up, and that's when we didn't decide, but that's when the powers that be decided to go up the mountain all the way up to as far as we could get up north.
As you were given those orders, did you kind of know what you were heading into?
Not really. We didn't know too much. In the military, and it might be entirely different today because, excuse me, it's so long ago, but the average person working in the average enlisted person or even the lower level officers really didn't have much information. We didn't really know where we were. As we got further north, we didn't even have American maps. We had maps that were from the Japanese, because the Japanese had occupied all of Korea for all those years. And so we knew nothing about, we would see a name of after we would get someplace, we were told the name of the hamlet or the city or whatever it was, but we had no knowledge of what it was all about. So we didn't really know where we were going. We knew why we were over there, to stop the communists from coming down and occupying all of Korea. And so we were with my battalion. I was part of an advanced party from our battalion that went out up to accompany the service the infantry. We had to go up to service the 1st Marine Division, but tank battalion. And my particular job, when we went up north, I was driving a service truck, large enclosed truck where we had tools and equipment and things like that. And it just happened that I was driving it on up there, so we had to start up the mountain, which quickly became just a single lane dirt road, and it hugged weaved through the valleys and along the side of the mountain for 70 miles on up to a town called Hagaru-ri, which was at the south end of the Chosin Reservoir, which was a large artificial body of water created by the North Koreans for their electric power and that. And that's as far as I got. Part of our infantry, two regiments of our infantry went about 15 miles further north on up the left side of the reservoir. But then the Chinese started to come in. That's when they came in right after Thanksgiving of 1950. And so our northward journey was ended at that point, and then it became a matter of survival to try to get out of there, because the 1st Marine Division, along with a regiment of the U.S. Army, the 31st Regiment, became trapped on the east side of the reservoir, and our two Marine regiments were on the left side of the reservoir, another Marine regiment south of us, holding the ground down there. And so there we were with 150,000 Chinese, and we had about 15,000 Marines up there. So we were there until trying to defend Hagaru. My company, the advanced party, part of what our duties was to defend we called it a mountain. It was a large, well, it was a mountain range, I guess, and called East Mountain, East Hill. And our responsibility was to guard that, to keep the Chinese from coming down from the north into Hagaru city itself, because we were building a improvised airstrip, or enlarging it at Hagaru to try to get supplies in, get casualties out, and things of that nature. So we were there on that particular assignment till the 6th of December is when a day before, the word came down that we were going to break out, and we only had the one road to go down. And it was a mountain on one side and going down the mountain on the other. So on the 6th of December, the convoy started. It was a convoy that lasted for miles and miles, and I'm not sure exactly where we fit into it as far as distance, but we started to leave the Hagaru area about 3 o'clock on that afternoon of the 6th of December. And I was driving that same truck. I had a fellow with me riding shotgun, and we had the rest of our people broke into infantry formations on either side of the convoy to try to keep it as safe as possible, but it was not too possible. And it got dark fairly rapidly up there, and by that time we were into the dark, and there was no lights on any of the vehicles allowed, no lights whatsoever, and it was a dark night. And we started down the road, and I think it was about 9 miles we got, and we had the Chinese had a roadblock set up where they had everything all zeroed in. And as we started into that, there was a little defilade there with a frozen creek bed. It was the things that complicated everything up there, like interject something, it was the cold weather. And we had temperatures that were down around 35 degrees below zero, and we had to be outside and without the protection, and there was frostbite, and there was all of this kind of stuff. But anyway, we got down to that. Personally, myself, got to this area, and there were trucks right in front of me, and there were trucks behind us, and other vehicles. And Chinese started shooting up the place there, and they hit my truck and destroyed the engine part of it, and we could see the tracers coming through the truck, and it never touched either one of us in the truck. Went behind us, shot up the back of the truck, and the truck was dead. I mean, it wouldn't move. And there were trucks behind us that couldn't go either way because there was no room. It was a one-lane road. And so we got out of the truck and managed to push it off to the side, and it was set on fire then so that the Chinese wouldn't recover anything from it. And then later on, while things were happening, then I was shot and wounded, and some of the fellows took me down to a ditch down a little bit further down there. That was about 9 o'clock at night, and I stayed in the ditch there along with some others who were wounded until about 6 in the morning, and then things had subsided a little bit because Chinese didn't like to fight too well in the daytime as much as they liked at night. And so things eased up a little bit, and so they put some of us into another truck and took us an additional 3 miles to a town called Coterie. And it was an improvised airfield built there, and I was loaded onto a Navy torpedo bomber. There were about 8 or 9 of us who were thrown into the bomb bay, and the Navy pilot managed to get it up off the ground, and we went back down to the seacoast down there to Ham Hung Nam. The Hung Nam and Ham Hung, I always got them confused. And later then I was put on a Air Force plane and taken over to Japan, and went by train from the Air Force base we landed at down to the Naval Hospital at Yokosuka, and I spent 7 weeks there, I guess. And after that, they said, "You're looking pretty good condition, so we're going to send you back to Korea." So I went back aboard ship, and of course, all of the 1st Marine Division had been evacuated from North Korea as of Christmas Eve day, I think was the last of them that went out. But by that time, I was in the hospital in Japan. And so then they regrouped down at Mason, down in the peninsula area down there on the lower part of the peninsula. And I rejoined my unit there, and then we had the spring offensive, and then the Chinese had a spring offensive, and worked our way back up past to the 38th parallel again. And at that point, was getting into May, and then I was rotated back home. So that was my experiences in Korea. So I did have 6 weeks in Japan in that little break of time there, so got to visit in Japan a little bit. So.
Are there any stories that you remember, anything that really stands out from your time?
As far as the combat experience, the one thing that always stands out in my mind, when the period of time we were in Wonsan, which was in October of 1950, our unit, where we were at, we began to smell an odor, and it was kind of a pretty area with kind of a gentle rolling hills. There was some orchards and stuff there anyway. So we decided to find out what the bad smell was. So we went out and went over a few of these hills, and there was dead civilians lying in rows that had been killed by the North Koreans when they were evacuating north. This was in North Korea. However, they were still going further north when we were first after them. And they had slaughtered in that group there was, I think, was reported 300 or 400 civilians that were killed, all men, women, and children, and just left there. And it was October, and the sun was still a little bit warm, and it caused the bodies to deteriorate and really smelled really bad. There were 4 or 5 other sites around the country that I did not see, but I saw that one personally. But around the country were similar things that happened, and the North Koreans were really brutal people.
How have your wartime experiences shaped how you view military service and war?
I think it's a necessary evil. It has been since the beginning of time, and I don't see that's ever going to change. But I think that at the time, you judge your leaders and whatnot, and Truman was the president, and he made the decision that he was going to stop the communists' advance down there, and I think that overall, I think he made the right decision. But there's been a lot of wars since, and nobody ever wins, I don't think. But it was an personal experience for me that in a way, you're glad that you went through it, but you'd never want to do it again. But then again, I had it much, much easier than those people who were right in the infantry and lived that entire time over there under fire. So our times under fire were outside of up at the reservoir where it was continual. The rest of it, there was periodic when you'd have artillery or whatever. But nothing like being up north.
As you were witnessing different things in Korea, how did you feel about that?
Well, it was kind of I think that fairly shortly you get a little bit numb to some of that stuff. I was just mentioning to somebody just recently that when we went ashore and I saw the first person dead body, and it reminded me of a mannequin. It was there, and it didn't look blown apart or anything like that. The person was just dead. And so you see things like that, and that kind of stuck in my mind. I can visualize that. And I think the dead probably stick in your mind as much as anything. And to see the dead children and dead women, certainly the dead men. I saw one instance, this was in Seoul, where North Korean tanks, they had Russian tanks, T-34s, and it had been hit with napalm. The Marines and the Navy use a lot of napalm over there, jellied gasoline that goes, and they had hit a tank down there just as the people were evacuating the tank, and one of the individuals was stuck to the faceplate of the tank. That always comes into my mind. I can remember that. And it's that part of it gets, it's something that doesn't go away. But at least it wasn't me stuck there. I mean, that's the way you continually look at it, I guess, a better he than me. So.
What kind of friendships or camaraderie did you form throughout your time? Well,
when the 2.5 years that I spent out at Camp Delmar, I had a lot of good friends there. And some of them, they come and go, their enlistments end, and so they go off back and do whatever they're going to do in their civilian life. Others went with me when our battalion went over with the division, and you'd see these people every day, and you lived with them, and it was some of them I saw later on in life, and others I never saw again. So most of them, or a good share of them that I've tried to keep up with, are deceased. Because our ranks are thinning very quickly now at all of our ages.
So what was the date that you rotated home, and where did you go?
Well, I arrived home on Memorial Day, back, I think it was still called Decoration Day at that point. Maybe it was Memorial Day. I arrived back home on May 30th at what was then called Wold Chamberlain Field. I was able to I got an airplane from San Francisco, and you had to pay your own way because I was still in, so I wasn't going I was coming home on leave actually, and got home, and it was quite a unique experience because prior to my going to Korea, oh, well, I'll back up. On June 25th, when the Korean War broke out, I was home on a 30-day leave. And I had a girlfriend back here that I had met before I went into the Marine Corps, and we had stayed in touch more with correspondence than anything else, except a couple leaves I was home on. And when on June 25th, I was home on leave, we had just gotten engaged. We were quite young, but we decided this is what we were going to do, so we got engaged. So while I was in Korea, I was married. And 9 days after I married, I went aboard ship to go over to Korea. And so then got home on May 30th, was her birthday. So that was quite a different type of a birthday present, I guess you'd call it. So we enjoyed that. And from then, she went with me then when I went down to Quantico, Virginia to finish out my time down there. We were in an organ. It was called Schools Troops, and we trained it was an officers candidate classes would come through there, and we'd do firing exercises and things of that nature for them.
And when were you discharged? Well,
I was discharged on the 27th day of January 1952, and then I think it was 4 or 5 years later I joined the Marine Corps Reserve here in Minneapolis, and was in the Air Wing out there, and we spent 9 years in the Air Wing. And I had 13 years total association with the Marine Corps. Then I decided to leave the Marine Corps because it conflicted with my civilian job, and that was the end of my military service. But Marine Corps was the greatest thing in the world to me, so I enjoyed it.
And why do you say that?
Because it taught me a lot of, at the time of my life that I went in, things were rather bleak. There was not much that I could do. I didn't have education at that time, and I couldn't see anything that was good. And I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed the life. The food was excellent, and the clothing was good. I liked the uniforms. I enjoyed my time in the military.
And where were you when the war ended?
I was back here in St. Paul, and that was 1953. And actually, the war never ended. You know, they signed a truce, but the war was never ended. And those years after that, and that was prior to my getting into the reserve, and so I had completely eliminated a great deal of all of that from my mind. And in fact, I think the older you get, the more you remember some of those things. And so I went through my civilian career, was in law enforcement, and employed as a postal inspector for the Postal Service, working mail fraud crimes and bombs and all that stuff. And was retired from that, and about that time I had heard about these organizations of veterans that were in the Korean War, and I joined the Korean War veteran group. And at about the same time, I heard about another organization, which was the Chosin Few, which was veterans of the Chosin Reservoir, a much more smaller group. It was only those of us who were up there that were eligible. And I joined that, and I became very active in that chapter. And I'm secretary of the chapter for the last 12, 15 years, something. So, and then you see people that were in the same circumstances you were, exchange stories, and so you do get a little more recollection of it. And the danger isn't there. You have the memories, but the danger isn't there.
So when the armistice was signed, how did that feel to hear that news?
I don't think that it impacted me. I don't think it impacted me a great deal at all. I can't remember any particular feelings about it one way or another. The truce talks went on so long that it seemed such a silly thing that was happening there that they just continued, and like so many things that our government does, they let things get out of hand, you know. So it's another thing. It didn't make much difference to me. As I say, at that time, I didn't have any association with the military because I had that period of time of 4 years before I went back in the reserve.
So when you arrived back from Korea, what was the reception like?
There wasn't any. Had absolutely none. We came into under the Golden Gate, went to Treasure Island is where we debarked, and went to the assigned naval facility there for our physicals and things of that nature. And I think we were there 3 days, and then we were allowed to get to wherever we were going the best way we could.
And how did that feel to arrive back?
Oh, that was exciting to come back to, because my mother and father and I had other siblings here, living here, and so it was exciting, and particularly to be met out at the airport by my wife, and her family brought her out there. Then you look upon what you're going to do, trying to make decisions as to whether to stay in the military for a career or what to do or where to go to school if you're going to go to school and things of that nature. So.
And what have you done since?
Well, I went to work with the Postal Service and was given an appointment to the Postal Inspection Service and was sent down to our academy in Washington, D.C. and for training for 7 months and separated again from the family. And then I worked in Chicago assigned to as a mail fraud specialist, and then in 1974 I was given the opportunity to transfer back here if I wanted to. So I came back to St. Paul and I worked as a postal inspector here till my retirement. It was a great career.
What kind of life lessons do you feel like you learned through your military service?
Well, you learn that you better look out for yourself, because there's not always going to be somebody there to look out for you. And you learned self-reliance, and you learn to be grateful for what you have and not always expect that there's going to be a great deal given to you. I think that's primarily what I learned as far as the military is concerned.
And are there any life message or a bit of input that you could give to younger generations?
In regard to the military or what, life? Well, life. I think that our life today is pretty much controlled by the social media, the younger people, and there's a lot more to life than that. Even us older people have engaged to a certain extent in it with the computers and whatnot. I know I have, but there's a lot to be, you shouldn't expect everything to be given to you by your parents or someone else. That you have to, you want something, you have to go out and earn it yourself.